Hi everyone. In today's video, we're going to talk about the final keyword within the Java programming language. Today's video is going to focus on three main uses of the final keyword. The first one is with variables, the second one is with methods, and the third one is with classes. In addition, a few other things I intend to hit on are good use cases for the final keyword, what the final keyword does not get for you, and then also some debate that you might see among the community with use of the final keyword. So, without further ado, let's get into some code. I'm going to make a new project. I'll call it final demo. Hit create. And then we have our generated main class. And then now I'm going to go ahead and make a new class called final demo. So within this final demo class, I'm going to go ahead and I'll create a public method called do something. For now, it won't take any parameters and it's not going to do anything. I'm going to create an instance of it within my main class. All right, I run this. And now it's telling me I have something to do here. Great. So to get started, I mentioned that I wanted to cover three different aspects of the final keyword. The first one will be with variables. So let's talk about using the final keyword with variables. So the final keyword precedes the type of the variable. So for example, if I want to change this code to call it final, all I would do is I would add the final keyword right there like that. And what that means here is that the assignment of the variable that I'm doing right here, I can no longer reassign the value. And that means different things depending on whether you're talking about primitives or references. I'll go into that in a little more detail here in a second, but to demonstrate first, if I go ahead and I just define all of my variables as final within my main class, you'll notice that the output hasn't changed. And that's to be expected, because all that I'm doing here is I'm saying that after my variable has had an assigned value, I can't change it. But you'll notice I'm not doing that here. So what the final keyword is doing in the case of variables in this particular instance is it is preventing the programmer from performing an error because they did a reassignment that they didn't intend. So to demonstrate that again, if I get rid of the final keyword here, I could do this. And now this compiles, albeit with a warning right here from IntelliJ. But watch as soon as I add the final keyword, now I've got an error. Cannot assign a value to final variable f. Cool, looks good. So now why don't I go in and do something? I'm gonna go ahead and pass in an integer. I'm gonna go ahead and call this int value. And I'm gonna print value. This is like how we normally do things. We pass in an argument into our function, and then we have the list of parameters within our method definition here. And then we use it just like how we normally would. The difference here is if I want to use the final keyword, I can also use it in the list of parameters defined within my method definition. So now the nice thing about this is I can read my method. I can read that first line there where I see the list of parameters, and I know that my method is not going to reassign the value of those parameters. And specifically in the case of primitives, that means that I can't touch anything about them. The nice thing for me that I like about the final keyword within the parameter list of a method is now I know that every single instance of this value field, if I had a really complicated method, none of it would ever change. Sure, I could look at the code and I could look for assignments, but now that I've known for certain, as soon as I were to reassign the value of a final variable, the compiler will refuse to compile the code. So that is a readability type thing for me. Some people have the opinion that the final keyword does add a lot of clutter. I can see the point there, and that's a lot of the argument behind folks who don't use the final keyword as much as I do, for example. But in the end, it depends on what you consider readable versus not. I personally like in my projects to use the final keyword quite often. So I've been skirting around a little bit talking about not changing the assignment of a variable. But technically, when you use the final keyword, you can change the underlying value that a reference points to, and that's one downside to the final keyword in my opinion. So let's go ahead and create a list of integers. We'll make it a new array list, and then we'll say mylist.add, and we'll go ahead and give it one element, and that element will have a value of 2. And now let's pass in my list, and we'll change this over here. And it's got a final value right now. So I'll print this, make sure that there's nothing awry over here. All right, looks good. And I even missed a final keyword right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and fix this. All right. So you might think now that I won't be able to change my list at all, but that's actually not quite true. If I go to final demo, what I'm not allowed to do is I can't do this. This is a compile time error. For similar reasons as with primitives, cannot assign a value to a final variable list. But there is one thing that I can do. I can still do this. If I print this out, uh-oh. So I used a final keyword, yet I still am modifying my list. Yeah, in my opinion, this was a miss within the Java language. I really think when the Java language designers added this final keyword concept, they really should have thought about a way to have immutable object references as well as what the reference points to. It is what it is. It's a bit of a limitation in the Java language. In my opinion, it's something that should be corrected or considered for a proposal in a future version. I will say though that not all hope is lost. Collections have a bit of a special case for this. If I do collections dot unmodifiable list and I pass in my list, you'll notice that while the code's still compiled, now we have an exception because we attempted to add something to an unmodifiable list. So this is a bit of an edge case where I'm not actually using the final keyword. I am getting around what I would consider deficiency in the language, which is being unable to prevent an object reference's pointed value from changing even though the reference itself is final. Not all object references do this though, so big point here is be very careful when you're using the final keyword with object references that you know what it does and what it doesn't. So for instance, I have the final keyword on my list. That means that I can't reassign my list, but I can change underlying my list as much as I want. Make sure when you are reviewing code and you're writing your own code that you or your friends or other developers whose code you're reviewing aren't making the mistake of assuming that the final keyword means that you can't change an underlying object reference. So now the next thing let's talk about is using the final keyword with methods. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean this up a little bit here, just to keep things simple. And now we have all these imports we don't need. All right. So the next usage of the final keyword is with methods. So if I go to the do something method, now what I can do is I can apply the final keyword to a method. This is a final method. If I run this, nothing's really changed from what we're used to. So what does the final keyword do for methods? Well, I'm glad you asked. What the final keyword does with methods is it ensures that if I were to create a subclass of final demo, that I cannot override this particular method. So this is important because when you think about inheritance and polymorphism, and from one of our previous videos, when you think about writing solid code with the open to extension, closed to modification principle, the final keyword within methods can be really, really useful. So for instance, let's say that I've got this superclass that has a whole bunch of functions and functionality that I want to maintain and I don't want to override it in my subclasses. And not only do I don't want to override it, I want to prevent overriding. Well, use the final keyword to do that. Just like you can use the abstract keyword to enforce that a subclass overrides a particular implementation, you use the final keyword to prevent overriding. So that's one thing that I appreciate about Java. It's got a way to force subclasses to provide an implementation, and it has a way to force subclasses to not provide an implementation. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate this here really quick by creating a new class called final subclass. And I'm going to say that it extends final demo. And now what we're going to see here is if I attempt to copy this and I use override. So what's going on? Do something cannot override do something in final demo because the overridden method is final. Sweet. So as expected, when I attempt to override a final method, I get a compilation error. Now, if I were to have a different do something method with a different method signature, like that, now I can override that. And this does work as expected. You can see there are no compilation errors. So the nice thing about adding the final keyword on a method is you can control which methods get overridden versus which don't. One other thing I did forget to mention is for those who are coming from a C and C++ background, when you want to do a const function or you add const arguments within your function, you can result in polymorphic behavior because the compiler treats that const declaration differently. Java doesn't handle it that way. So what I mean by that is, let's say that I copy this, and now all I do is I just change this to final, and now I'm dealing with a final integer versus a regular integer. Java doesn't see these as any different. And the reason for that, again, comes down to the semantics of how final is used. Final prevents a different assignment of the variable. What it doesn't do is have other guarantees on the reference values themselves. So again, I'm harping on Java a little bit here. I love the final keyword, but it does have its limitations. For the folks who write C++ code that focus on const correctness, you can only get so far with Java with final. It's still good, in my opinion, to make use of as much as you can with the final keyword, but it can't do quite as much as const can do in C++ or C. All right, so the last major thing I want to hit on now is applying the final keyword to a class. Let me clean up a little bit of code here. All right. Can you guess what the final keyword with a class does? Think about what it does with a method. With a method, it prevents the subclasses from overriding it. So if I were to use this on a class, cannot inherit from final demo. Bingo. So you can use the final keyword on a class to prevent it from being inherited from. You might be thinking, why in the world would you do that? Well, there are actually some really good reasons. One of the main reasons that you see a lot is for security. So let's say that you've got a class that holds some particular data and you want to make sure that the data gets handled in a secure fashion, and you don't want to be able to create a subclass that doesn't handle the data correctly. A great example of this is string. Java strings within the language are considered final, and you cannot override string. And that's very intentional because when you're talking about strings, there are all sorts of properties of strings that you want to be able to maintain within the string class. And if you made an overridden implementation of it and now you started passing around your subclass instance of string, but you were using polymorphism to refer to everything else as string, you might start seeing very unintended behavior. including some security holes within your software. So as far as whether to mark your classes as final versus not, that's kind of a personal preference thing. I err on the side of, if I don't intend for my class to be inherited, I mark it final. And if I do intend for my class to be inherited, I make it very clear within the documentation of my code, hey, this can have subclasses, or I just make a subclass for it right away so that other developers know that I can have an API open to extension as far as subclassing. A good example of another type of class that you typically wouldn't want to override and you could mark final would be a utility class, something that performs a lot of static methods, something that doesn't maintain a lot of state, something that doesn't really make sense to have a child class. You can mark that as final right away because you don't want it to be extended. All right, so now I don't need this class, so I'm going to delete it. Yes, that's fine. So now for the last part of the video, I want to talk about some community guidelines when it comes to the final keyword, why there's a little bit of debate on how often you use it, and my personal gripe with how the language was designed from the very early stages. So one thing you'll see is when you work between teams as you go along your Java journey, more often than not, your teams are going to not use the final keyword very much, and they're going to look at you weirdly if you're using final every single chance you get. And they might even ask, oh, that kind of clutters up the code, why are you doing that? That's one camp. Then there's another camp, which is use the final keyword every possible place you ever could use it. And the people over here will tell you, hey, these 20 variables can all be final. Why aren't you doing that? And both camps have valid points. Typically, if I had to put myself within one of these two camps, I would put myself maybe around here somewhere. I like to use the final keyword where it makes sense, but I don't use it so much that as soon as I make a class, I assume it's final immediately, and then whoops, I need to extend it. Now I need to open it back up. So, because I think that goes a little bit too far, but I do tend to like to use the final keyword where possible. So along those lines, one of the major issues that I have with Java is I wish from the start they would assume when you declare a variable that the variable is final unless you tell the compiler that it's actually mutable. For those who know Rust, this is one of the main principles that Rust is built on, and this is something that I really like about Rust that I think Java should have taken. And what this ensures is basically all programmers now have immutable data, and they write their program such that all variables and such are considered immutable until you have a case where you have to have mutability. I think that's a much better design principle rather than assuming mutability and then in the one-off case that you know you're not going to change it, you make it immutable. Just my opinion. People in the comments section of this video might disagree with me, or I might start a debate, I don't know. But I can tell you that my opinion at least is that default immutability is much more powerful than default mutability. And that's the final keyword within a nutshell. The final keyword has good uses. It also has its limitations. If you're working on a team or you're working on some code that's already pre-existing, I'd probably recommend going with the flow as far as how final is used within that code. If you are writing new code, I would encourage you to play around with usages of final and try to use it a little more on the side of utilizing it more rather than less, because it is a language feature we can use. Even though readability arguably gets a little bit worse with it, I don't think it really does. I think that's a bit of a personal preference thing. But to each their own, right? With that, I think I'm going to close out for today's video. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did, please do hit that like button. Drop a comment below if you thought this was interesting or if you have any additional commentary on things I didn't hit on. Thanks for watching today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.